Hello, and welcome to Immersive History for Sleep. Picture yourself standing on a wind-swept shore in the grey light of dawn. The cold North Sea crashes against weathered rocks, and the salt spray stings your face. Before you lies a sleek wooden vessel, its dragon-head prow carved with fierce eyes that seem to pierce the morning mist. This is no ordinary ship. This is a longship, and you are about to embark on one of history's most feared adventures. You are about to become a Viking raider. For centuries, the very word Viking has conjured images of savage warriors descending from the northern seas like wolves upon the fold. But who were these people really? What drove them from their homes in Scandinavia to sail into the unknown, to risk everything for the chance of plunder and glory? Tonight, we will journey back more than 1,000 years to experience life through the eyes of a Viking raider. We will feel the spray of the ocean as our longship cuts through treacherous waters. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with hardened warriors as we approach foreign shores under cover of darkness. We will discover what it truly meant to live by the sword in an age when might made right and honor was worth more than life itself. But before our voyage begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Our journey takes us to the fjords and forests of medieval Scandinavia, to a time when the sea was both highway and battlefield, and when a man's worth was measured not in gold, but in the courage of his heart and the strength of his sword arm. The world of the Viking raider was born from necessity as much as ambition. In the harsh landscapes of 8th and 9th century Scandinavia, survival itself was a daily battle. The summers were brief and precious, the winters long and merciless. The soil was thin and rocky, yielding meagre harvests even in the best of years. For many families, especially younger sons who would inherit little or nothing from their fathers, the traditional paths of farming and herding offered only a life of grinding poverty and endless toil. But the Scandinavians possessed something their southern neighbours did not. They had mastered the art of building ships unlike any the world had ever seen. The longship was a marvel of medieval engineering, a vessel that could carry 30 to 60 warriors across the open ocean, yet draw so little water that it could navigate the shallowest rivers. Its shallow draft meant it could be beached directly on any shore, allowing for swift surprise attacks where no enemy expected them. With its single square sail and banks of oars, it could move with deadly efficiency, whether powered by wind or human muscle. To understand the mind of a Viking raider, we must first understand the society that shaped him. This was a world governed by concepts that seem alien to our modern sensibilities. Honor was not merely important, it was everything. A man's reputation, his standing in the community, his very identity, all rested on his ability to defend his honor and that of his family. To be called a coward was worse than death. To fail to avenge an insult or injury was to lose one's place among men. The Norse concept of fate, or weird, permeated every aspect of life. The Vikings believed that each person's destiny was woven by the Norns, 3 ancient sisters who sat at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree. No man could escape his fate, and to die fighting bravely was the highest honor one could achieve. Those who fell in battle with weapons in their hands would be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where they would feast and fight until the end of the world. This belief created warriors who were genuinely fearless in battle, for death in combat was not an end but a glorious beginning. The decision to become a raider was rarely made alone. Young men would gather in the great halls during the long winter nights, listening to the skalds' tales of distant lands rich with gold and silver, of monasteries bursting with treasures, of kingdoms too weak to defend their wealth. The stories were intoxicating, painting pictures of adventure and riches that seemed impossible to resist. As the ale flowed and the fire crackled, oaths would be sworn, crews would be formed, and plans would be laid for the coming spring. The process of assembling a raiding crew was both art and science. A successful raid required more than just brave warriors. It needed men with specialized skills. There had to be a navigator who could read the stars and the subtle signs of wind and wave. There had to be craftsmen who could repair the ship when it was damaged by storms or battle. There had to be men who knew foreign languages and customs intelligence about potential, who could gather targets. Most importantly, there had to be a leader whose reputation and charisma could hold the crew together through the hardships and dangers that lay ahead. The leader of a Viking raiding party was known as a jarl, or sometimes simply as a sea king. He was not chosen by birth or appointment, but by the voluntary allegiance of free men who believed in his ability to lead them to victory and wealth. His authority was absolute once at sea, but it was an authority that had to be earned and maintained through success. A leader who failed to deliver promised riches, who made poor decisions that cost men their lives, or who showed cowardice in the face of danger, would quickly find himself abandoned by his followers. The selection of targets was a crucial decision that could mean the difference between triumphant return and disaster. The Vikings were not mindless barbarians striking at random. They were skilled intelligence gatherers who carefully studied their potential victims before launching an attack. Traders, traveling merchants, and captured prisoners all provided valuable information about the wealth and defenses of distant settlements. Monasteries were particularly attractive targets, not because the Vikings had any special hatred of Christianity, but because they were wealthy, poorly defended, and often located in remote areas where help would be slow to arrive. The monks had accumulated vast treasures over the years: gold and silver altarpieces, jeweled manuscripts, precious relics, and most importantly, they were bound by their religious vows not to bear arms in their own defense. To a Viking raider, a monastery was like a treasure chest, guarded only by old men with no weapons. Coastal trading towns were another favoured target. These settlements were rich with goods from distant lands, their warehouses filled with furs, amber, spices, and silver. They were usually defended by only a small garrison of professional soldiers, and their wooden buildings would burn quickly if the raiders needed to create chaos to cover their escape. The timing of a raid was as important as the target. Viking raiders preferred to strike during the spring and summer months when the seas were calmer and travel was easier. They would often time their attacks to coincide with religious festivals, when the local population would be gathered in churches or at religious sites, leaving their homes and businesses relatively undefended. The element of surprise was crucial, as it allowed a small force of raiders to overcome much larger numbers of defenders who were caught unprepared. The preparation for a raid began months in advance. The longship had to be thoroughly inspected and repaired after its winter storage. The hull would be scraped clean of barnacles and resealed with tar. The rigging would be checked and replaced where necessary. Most importantly, the ship would be loaded with everything the crew would need for what might be weeks or even months at sea. Each raider was responsible for bringing his own weapons and armor. A well-equipped Viking warrior would carry a sword, a spear, an axe, a shield, and a sayax, a long knife that served as both weapon and tool. The wealthy might own a shirt of mail, laboriously crafted from thousands of iron rings, while poorer men made do with leather jerkins reinforced with metal studs. Helmets were simple iron caps. Contrary to popular myth, they never had horns, which would have been both impractical and dangerous in battle. The weapons of a Viking raider were more than mere tools. They were extensions of his soul. A good sword was often given a name and passed down from father to son for generations. These blades were forged with techniques that created steel of remarkable quality, pattern welded to create both strength and flexibility. The best swords were said to possess almost magical properties, and their owners would compose poems in their honor. Beyond weapons, each man had to bring his personal supplies for the voyage. This included food that would not spoil during long weeks at sea, thick woolen cloaks to ward off the cold, and whatever small luxuries he could afford. Some men brought dice carved from bone for gambling during the long hours between rowing shifts. Others brought small silver arm rings that could be cut into pieces to make purchases or pay debts. A few might carry small wooden figurines of the gods for protection and luck. The longship itself had to be provisioned for the journey. Barrels of fresh water were the most critical cargo, as finding safe drinking water in foreign lands could be impossible. Dried fish, hard bread, cheese and preserved meat formed the bulk of the food supplies. Beer or mead provided both nutrition and a way to make questionable water safer to drink. Emergency supplies of rope, spare oars, sailcloth, and tools for ship repair were essential for surviving the inevitable storms and accidents that would occur during a long voyage. As the day of departure approached, the entire community would become involved in the preparations. Wives and mothers would work tirelessly to prepare food for the journey and to mend clothing and equipment. Children would help carry supplies to the ship and would listen wide-eyed to the warriors' boasts about the great deeds they would perform. The local blacksmith would work day and night sharpening weapons and making last-minute repairs to armor and tools. The night before departure was traditionally marked by a great feast in the community's hall. This was both a celebration and a solemn ritual, for everyone knew that some of the young men, now laughing and boasting around the fire, would never return. The skald would recite the ancient poems that told of the great heroes of the past, their deeds serving as inspiration for the raiders who would soon face their own tests of courage and skill. The ritual of departure was steeped in ceremony and superstition. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, the raiders would make their way to the shore where their longship waited like a sleeping dragon. The ship would have been blessed by the local priest or wise woman, its dragon prow anointed with the blood of a sacrificed animal to ensure the favor of the gods. Each man would touch the carved head as he boarded, murmuring a prayer to Odin for victory or to Thor for protection from the storms that lay ahead. The moment of casting off was electric with anticipation and fear. Mothers and wives stood on the shore, their faces masks of stoic pride that barely concealed their terror. Children waved excitedly, too young to understand that they might never see their fathers or brothers again. The older men of the community, those whose raiding days were behind them, watched with a mixture of nostalgia and relief, remembering their own first voyages into the unknown. As the longship pulled away from shore, powered by the rhythmic stroke of 30 oars, the familiar coastline would gradually fade into the morning mist. For many of the younger raiders, this was their first time leaving sight of land, and the vastness of the open ocean could be overwhelming. The experienced men would watch for signs of seasickness or panic among the newcomers, ready to offer encouragement or, if necessary, harsh discipline to maintain order. Life aboard a longship during a raiding voyage was a test of endurance that separated the strong from the weak. The vessel was cramped beyond belief, with 60 men and all their supplies packed into a space no larger than a modern tennis court. There was no privacy, no shelter from the elements, and no escape from the constant motion of the ship as it rode the swells of the North Sea. Men slept where they sat at their rowing benches, wrapped in their cloaks and pressed against their neighbours for warmth. The daily routine was dictated by the wind and weather. When conditions were favourable, the crew would raise the great square sail, its red and white stripes visible for miles across the water. The ship would leap forward like a living thing, its dragon head cutting through the waves as the wind filled the woolen cloth. These were the golden hours when the raiders could rest their aching arms and backs, when they could share stories and songs to pass the time. But when the wind died or turned against them, the crew would have to take to the oars. The work was back-breaking, requiring perfect coordination, as 30 men pulled in unison to the rhythm set by the steersman. Hour after hour they would row, their hands bleeding from the rough wood of the oar handles, their muscles screaming with exhaustion. The salt spray would sting their eyes and crack their lips, while the constant motion of the ship made even the simple act of eating or drinking a challenge. The hierarchy aboard a raiding ship was rigid and unforgiving. The Jarl commanded absolute authority, making all decisions about course, tactics, and the distribution of any plunder they might acquire. Beneath him were his most trusted followers, men who had proven themselves in previous raids and who could be counted on to maintain discipline among the crew. At the bottom were the young men making their first voyage, who were expected to work the hardest, eat the least, and prove their worth through uncomplaining service. Navigation was an art that bordered on the mystical. The Vikings had no compass, no maps in the modern sense, and no instruments beyond their own senses and hard-won experience. They navigated by the stars when the skies were clear, by the flight patterns of seabirds, by the colour and movement of the water, and by subtle changes in wind and weather that spoke to those who knew how to listen. The best navigators were treated with almost religious reverence, for a single miscalculation could doom the entire crew to death in the trackless ocean. The most feared enemy was not other warriors, but the sea itself. Storms could arise with terrifying speed, transforming calm waters into a chaos of mountainous waves that could crush a longship like kindling. When the weather turned violent, there was nothing the crew could do but lash down everything that could move, bail frantically to keep the ship from swamping, and pray to whatever gods they favoured. Many raiders who had faced enemy spears without flinching would weep with terror as their ship was tossed about like a toy in the grip of a North Sea gale. Food and water were constant concerns during a long voyage. The supplies that had seemed adequate when loaded at home had a way of dwindling alarmingly as the days passed. Fresh water was strictly rationed, with each man receiving only enough to sustain life. Food became monotonous and increasingly unpalatable as the voyage wore on, the dried fish growing mouldy, the bread becoming infested with weevils, the cheese turning rancid in the salt air. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at men's bellies and shortening their tempers. Disease was another ever-present threat in the cramped confines of the longship. A single case of dysentery or fever could spread through the crew like wildfire, leaving men too weak to row or fight. There were no doctors aboard, only a few men with rudimentary knowledge of herbs and healing. The wounded or sick were cared for as best as possible by their comrades, but many who fell ill during a voyage would be committed to the waves wrapped in their cloaks, their weapons placed beside them for their journey to the afterlife. The psychological pressure of a raiding voyage was as challenging as the physical hardships. Men were separated from everything familiar and comforting, thrust into an environment where death could come at any moment from storm, disease, or enemy action. The bonds between crew members became stronger than those of blood brothers, forged in shared hardship and mutual dependence. Yet these same bonds could be strained to the breaking point by hunger, fear, and the maddening confinement of weeks at sea. As the long ship approached enemy waters, the atmosphere aboard would change dramatically. The casual conversation and storytelling of the open ocean would give way to tense preparation for battle. Weapons would be sharpened one final time, armour would be checked and adjusted, and each man would make his private peace with whatever gods he served. The younger raiders would struggle to hide their fear behind masks of bravado, while the veterans would grow quiet and thoughtful, their minds focused on the deadly work ahead. The first sight of a foreign coast brought a mixture of excitement and terror. This was the moment they had travelled hundreds of miles to reach, the culmination of months of planning and weeks of hardship. But it was also the point of no return. Once they made landfall and began their raid, they would be committed to a course of action that would end either in glorious victory or violent death. There would be no quarter asked or given, no mercy shown or expected. The approach to the target required all the skill and cunning the raiders possessed. They would study the coastline for hours, looking for the best landing spot, watching for signs of defenders, or warning beacons that might alert the countryside to their presence. The ideal landing was a secluded beach near their target, preferably under cover of darkness or in the grey light of dawn when visibility was poor and most people would still be asleep. The final preparations for landing were conducted in absolute silence. Armour was donned, weapons were distributed, and the crew was organised into fighting groups. Each man knew his role, whether it was to secure the beachhead, guard the ship, or join the main assault force. The dragonhead would be removed from the prow and carefully stowed, for it was believed that its fierce visage might anger the land spirits of the foreign shore, and an angry spirit could bring bad luck to the entire enterprise. As the longship's keel scraped against the sand and shingle of an enemy beach, 60 pairs of eyes would scan the shoreline for any sign of movement. Hearts would pound with anticipation and fear. Hands would grip weapon hilts with white knuckles, and each man would offer a final silent prayer to his chosen god. The moment had come to discover whether months of preparation and weeks of hardship would lead to wealth and glory, or to death on a foreign shore far from home and family. The first moments ashore were the most dangerous. As the longship ground against the beach, the raiders would leap into the surf, their boots splashing through the cold water as they hauled their vessel up onto the sand. Speed was essential now, for every second they lingered on the exposed shoreline increased their chances of discovery. The ship had to be secured quickly, positioned so that it could be launched at a moment's notice if a hasty retreat became necessary. The beach party would spread out in a defensive perimeter while the main force organised itself for the assault. Scouts would be sent ahead to confirm the location of their target and to watch for any signs that their arrival had been detected. These men moved like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness, their years of hunting in the forests of Scandinavia serving them well as they crept through unfamiliar terrain. The psychology of the Viking raider in these moments before battle was complex and contradictory. Fear and excitement warred in their hearts, creating a volatile mixture that could explode into berserker fury or paralyze a man with terror. The experienced warriors knew how to channel this energy, using their fear to sharpen their senses while drawing upon their training and faith to steady their nerves. The younger men struggled more, their bodies trembling with adrenaline as they gripped their weapons and tried to remember everything they had been taught. The signal to advance would come from the Jarl, usually a simple gesture or whispered command that would ripple through the ranks. Then, like a pack of wolves closing on their prey, the raiders would begin their approach to the target. They moved in silence, their soft leather boots making no sound on the dew-wet grass, their mail shirts carefully wrapped to prevent the rings from clinking together. Every man knew that discovery now could mean the difference between a successful raid and a bloody disaster. The typical monastery or village in the early morning hours was a scene of peaceful vulnerability that would have stirred pity in gentler hearts. Thin columns of smoke rose from cooking fires as the inhabitants began their daily routines. Monks would be gathering in their chapel for morning prayers, their voices raised in Latin hymns that drifted across the still air. Villagers would be tending to their animals or preparing for another day of honest labour. None suspected that death was creeping towards them through the morning mist. The moment of attack was explosive and terrifying. At the Jarl's signal, the raiders would burst from concealment with blood-curdling war cries that shattered the morning calm like thunder. The famous Viking battle cry, a howl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself, was designed to paralyze enemies with fear before the first blow was struck. The sound would echo off buildings and hills, amplics of the landscape, ified by the acoust, until it seemed as though an entire army of demons had descended upon the settlement. The initial assault was crucial to the success of any raid. The Vikings relied on shock and overwhelming violence to break the will of their opponents before organized resistance could form. They would strike multiple targets simultaneously, setting fire to buildings to create panic and confusion, while the main force secured the most valuable prizes. The sight of their own homes burning, combined with the terrifying appearance of the mail-clad warriors with their painted shields and gleaming weapons, was usually enough to send the local population fleeing in terror. For the defenders, these first moments were a nightmare beyond imagination. Peaceful farmers and craftsmen, rudely awakened by the sounds of battle, would stumble from their homes to find their world transformed into a scene from the apocalypse. Buildings were already aflame, neighbors were screaming and running in all directions, and everywhere they looked were fierce strangers with weapons who seemed intent on killing everyone they encountered. The Vikings showed no mercy to those who offered resistance. A man who raised a weapon against them, even in defense of his family, could expect no quarter. The raiders' own survival depended on maintaining their reputation for ruthless efficiency. Word of their terrible vengeance would spread to other settlements, making future raids easier as terrified populations would choose flight over futile resistance. But not all the violence was mindless brutality. The experienced raiders knew that dead men could tell no tales and carry no treasures. Prisoners, especially those who appeared wealthy or important, were valuable commodities that could be ransomed back to their families or sold in the slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby. A wise raider would try to capture rather than kill when possible, though the heat of battle often made such distinctions impossible. The search for treasure was systematic and thorough. Viking raiders were expert at identifying valuable items, having learned through experience what goods commanded high prices in the markets of Scandinavia and beyond. Gold and silver were always prized, but they also sought fine weapons, jewelry, rich fabrics, amber, and exotic spices. Religious items were particularly valuable, not for any spiritual significance, but because they were often made from precious metals and adorned with gems. The monastery treasuries were the richest prizes of all. Here, accumulated over generations, were the donations of pious nobles and wealthy merchants. Golden altarpieces, silver chalices encrusted with jewels, illuminated manuscripts whose vellum pages were decorated with gold leaf, and reliquaries containing the bones of saints set in precious metals. To the Christian monks, these were sacred objects beyond price. To the Viking raiders, they were simply the most concentrated wealth they were likely to find in one place. The division of spoils was a delicate matter that required careful handling by the Jarl. Every man in the crew had risked his life for this moment, and each expected his fair share of the treasure. The traditional system was that the leader took the largest portion, usually about a third of everything captured, while the remainder was divided among the crew according to their rank and contribution to the expedition. Disputes over the division of loot could quickly escalate into violence, and many successful raids ended in bloodshed when the participants turned on each other. Time was always the enemy during a raid. The longer the Vikings remained ashore, the greater the chance that word of their presence would spread to nearby settlements or military garrisons. Messengers might already be racing along Roman roads to alert local lords or royal officials. Professional soldiers might be marching toward the sound of battle. Every minute spent searching for additional treasure increased the risk that the raiders would find themselves trapped between a hostile population and an organized military response. The retreat to the longship was often as dangerous as the initial assault. Laden with heavy treasure chests and driving captives before them, the raiders had to cover the same ground they had crossed in darkness, but now in full daylight and with their mobility severely compromised. Local inhabitants who had fled in terror during the attack might have regrouped and organized an ambush along the route back to the beach. Armed peasants hiding in forests or behind stone walls could inflict serious casualties on the withdrawing raiders. The loading of the ship had to be accomplished with frantic haste. Treasure chests were hurled into the hull while prisoners were bound and forced aboard. The most valuable captives, those who might bring high ransoms, were treated with relative care, but common slaves were handled with brutal efficiency. Men, women, and children, who only hours before had been living peaceful lives in their own homes, now found themselves chained in the bottom of a foreign ship, facing a future of slavery in distant lands. The final moments on the beach were filled with desperate urgency. Every raider knew that discovery by a superior force would likely mean death or capture for the entire crew. The longship had to be launched quickly, pushed out into deeper water where its shallow draft and speed would give the Vikings the advantage over any pursuing vessels. The crew would leap aboard as the ship moved through the surf, grabbing their oars even as they struggled to find their seats. Once the longship was safely away from shore, the atmosphere would change dramatically. The tension of the raid would give way to exhausted relief and growing exhilaration as the crew realized they had succeeded. The treasure would be examined and roughly inventoried, leading to excited discussions about how rich each man would be when they returned home. Stories would be told and retold of particularly brave or skillful deeds performed during the attack, with each telling growing more elaborate and heroic. But the voyage home was not simply a victory celebration. The ship was now heavily loaded with treasure and prisoners, making it sit lower in the water and respond more sluggishly to wind and oar. The additional weight meant longer rowing shifts for the crew and increased difficulty in handling rough weather. The prisoners required constant guarding and had to be fed and watered, further straining the ship's supplies. The captives themselves presented unique challenges for their captors. Many the trauma were in shock from seeing their homes destroyed and their families killed or separated. Some would try to throw themselves overboard rather than face slavery, requiring the raiders to keep them under close watch. Others would attempt to organize escapes or uprisings, particularly dangerous in the confined space of the longship, where a desperate prisoner with nothing to lose might grab a weapon and kill several Vikings before being subdued. The return voyage often took a different route than the outbound journey, both to avoid potential pursuers and to strike at additional targets if opportunities presented themselves. A successful crew might raid several settlements along a coast before turning for home, accumulating wealth and prisoners at each stop. But each additional attack increased their risk of discovery and retaliation, requiring careful judgment by the Jarl about when enough was enough. Weather remained a constant threat during the homeward journey. The extra weight in the ship made it more vulnerable to swamping and heavy seas, while the presence of prisoners meant that every hand could not be used for bailing or managing the sail. Storms that might have been merely uncomfortable on the outbound voyage could now be genuinely life-threatening, capable of sending the entire crew and their hard-won treasure to the bottom of the sea. The psychological state of the crew during the return voyage was complex and often volatile. The successful completion of a raid brought tremendous satisfaction and pride, but it also triggered a letdown as the intense excitement of battle gave way to the routine drudgery of sailing. Some men would become moody and difficult, their systems still flooded with the adrenaline of combat, but now having no outlet for their aggressive energy. Others would become obsessed with their share of the treasure, constantly checking and rechecking their portion of the loot. The approach to home waters brought its own set of emotions. Relief at having survived the dangers of the raid and the long voyage home, mixed with anticipation of the welcome that awaited them. But there was also anxiety about how their deeds would be received by the community, and uncertainty about how the division of treasure would be finalized once they were back on land. Some men worried about how they would explain the loss of close friends or brothers who had not returned from the raid. The first sight of familiar coastline after weeks or months at sea was always an emotional moment. Men who had maintained stoic composure through battles and storms would find themselves weeping at the sight of their homeland. The smell of the familiar forests, the sound of seabirds they had known since childhood, the glimpse of smoke rising from hearth fires in their own village, all combined to create an overwhelming sense of homecoming that could bring even hardened warriors to their knees. The arrival of a successful raiding crew was one of the great events in the life of a Viking community. Word would spread quickly that a longship was approaching the harbour, and crowds would gather on the beach to welcome the returning heroes. Wives and mothers would scan the faces of the crew anxiously, their hearts lifting at the sight of their loved ones or breaking at their absence. Children would run alongside the ship as it was hauled up onto the beach, their eyes wide with excitement at the sight of the treasure chests and exotic prisoners. The unloading of the longship was a ceremony as much as a practical necessity. Each chest of treasure was carried ashore with reverence, its weight a testament to the courage and skill of the men who had claimed it. The prisoners, blinking in the unfamiliar northern light, were herded together under guard, while the community gathered to marvel at these strange people from distant lands. Children who had never seen a southerner would stare in wonder at their different clothing, their foreign features, their incomprehensible speech. The Jarl would address the assembled crowd, recounting the deeds of his crew and honouring those who had shown exceptional bravery during the raid. This was not merely boastful storytelling, but an essential ritual that transformed the violence of the raid into something noble and heroic. The community needed to hear that their young men had conducted themselves with honour, that they had proven themselves worthy of their ancestors, that their dangerous journey had served a greater purpose than mere greed. The formal division of treasure took place in the Great Hall before the entire community. This was a sacred moment, governed by ancient traditions and overseen by the most respected elders. Each man's share was calculated not just based on his rank, but on his specific contributions during the voyage. The warrior who had struck the first blow in battle, the sailor who had spotted the enemy coast, the man who had discovered the monastery's hidden treasury, all might receive additional rewards beyond their basic portion. The treasure itself told the story of the raid in ways that words could not. Byzantine coins spoke of trade routes that stretched to Constantinople. Irish gold revealed the wealth of Celtic monasteries. Frankish silver bore witness to the prosperity of Charlemagne's empire. Each piece was examined and discussed, its origins debated and its value estimated. The community was learning about the wider world through these fragments of foreign wealth. Their understanding of distant lands shaped by the spoils their warriors had brought home. The integration of prisoners into Viking society was a complex process that revealed much about Norse culture. Those of high rank or valuable skills might find themselves treated with relative kindness, their talents recognized, and their eventual freedom a possibility if sufficient ransom could be arranged. A captured monk who could read and write might become a valued scribe. A skilled craftsman could find his abilities much in demand. A beautiful woman might become a concubine, or even, in rare cases, a wife if she proved adaptable to her new circumstances. For most captives, however, the future was one of hard labour and servitude. They would be distributed among the crew members as part of their share of the spoils, becoming thralls who would spend their lives working in the fields, tending livestock, or performing the countless menial tasks that kept a Viking household functioning. Their children, if they had any, would be born into slavery, though Norse law did provide some protections and even paths to eventual freedom for those who served faithfully. The immediate aftermath of a successful raid was a time of celebration that could last for days or even weeks. The Great Hall would echo with the sound of feasting and storytelling as the community honoured its returning heroes. Mead and ale flowed freely, paid for with the silver and gold the raiders had brought home. The skald would work frantically to compose new verses celebrating the deeds of the crew, immortalising their courage in the epic poems that would be recited for generations to come. But even as the community celebrated, the successful raiders were already beginning to plan their next expedition. The taste of wealth and adventure was intoxicating, and few men who had experienced the thrill of a successful raid were content to return permanently to the mundane life of farming and fishing. Weapons needed to be repaired or replaced. The longship required maintenance after its arduous voyage. New crew members had to be recruited to replace those who had been lost or who had decided to retire from raiding. The winter months that followed a successful raiding season were a time of preparation and anticipation. The treasure gained from the summer's expeditions would be carefully hoarded, some of it used to improve the raiders' equipment, and some saved to finance future voyages. The weapons taken from defeated enemies would be studied and copied by local blacksmiths, incorporating the best foreign techniques into Norse military technology. The knowledge gained about distant lands and their defenses would be shared and discussed, creating detailed intelligence about potential future targets. The psychological impact of raiding extended far beyond the immediate participants. Young boys who had stayed behind would listen wide-eyed to the stories of adventure and violence, dreaming of the day when they would be old enough to join a crew. They would practice with wooden swords and shields, imitating the fighting techniques they had seen demonstrated by the returning warriors. The culture was creating its next generation of raiders, passing down not just the technical skills of seamanship and warfare, but the values and attitudes that made such a life seem desirable. The influence of successful raiders on their communities was profound and lasting. Men who returned with great wealth could afford to build larger halls, to support more retainers, to commission fine weapons and jewelry from the best craftsmen. They became leaders not just through their prowess in battle, but through their ability to distribute wealth and create opportunities for others. A successful Jarl might finance multiple raiding expeditions, taking a share of the profits from each while providing young men with chances to win their own fame and fortune. The religious implications of raiding were complex and often contradictory. While the Vikings worshipped gods of war like Odin and Thor, they also believed in concepts of honor and justice that sometimes conflicted with the brutal realities of their lifestyle. The attack on Christian monasteries was not motivated by religious hatred, but by practical considerations of wealth and defense. Yet many raiders struggled with the moral implications of their actions, particularly when they witnessed the genuine piety and peaceful nature of their victims. The seasonal nature of raiding created a rhythm that dominated Viking society for generations. Spring was the time of preparation and departure, when young men's thoughts turned to adventure and older warriors felt the call of the sea. Summer was the season of violence and opportunity, when the northern seas were filled with longships carrying death and destruction to foreign shores. Autumn brought the return of the survivors, laden with treasure and tales of their exploits. Winter was the time of reflection and planning, when the community absorbed the impact of the year's adventures and prepared for the cycle to begin anew. The economic impact of raiding on Viking society cannot be overstated. The wealth flowing into Scandinavia from successful expeditions transformed entire regions, funding the development of new technologies, the construction of impressive buildings, and the creation of sophisticated trade networks. Towns like Hedeby and Birka became major commercial centers, partly because they served as markets for the goods and slaves acquired through raiding. The silver and gold captured from monasteries and trading centers provided the capital that allowed Viking merchants to establish themselves as major players in international commerce. The evolution of raiding tactics over time reflected the growing sophistication of both the Vikings and their enemies. Early raids relied almost entirely on surprise and overwhelming force, striking at completely unprepared targets who had no experience dealing with seaborne attacks. As word of the Viking threats spread and defenses improved, the raiders had to adapt their methods. They developed new techniques for siege warfare, learned to coordinate attacks on multiple targets simultaneously, and began to form larger expeditions capable of taking on well-defended positions. The relationship between raiding and legitimate trade was often blurred beyond recognition. Many Viking expeditions combined both activities, raiding weak targets while trading peacefully with stronger ones. A crew might attack an undefended monastery in the morning and conduct a legitimate business at a nearby trading post in the afternoon. The same men who struck terror into the hearts of their enemies were often welcomed as valued customers in the markets of Europe, their silver and gold talking louder than their fearsome reputations. The legacy of the Viking raider extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted on their victims. The constant threat of attack forced European societies to develop new defensive strategies and military technologies. Coastal communities learned to build stronger fortifications and maintain better communication systems. The feudal system that came to dominate medieval Europe was partly a response to the need for rapid military mobilization against Viking raids. The very structure of medieval society bore the imprint of the northern warriors who had terrorized it for generations. The psychological warfare practiced by Viking raiders was as important as their physical attacks. The carefully cultivated reputation for extreme violence and the dramatic appearance of their ships and warriors were designed to paralyze enemies with fear before the first blow was struck. The sight of a longship's dragon head emerging from the morning mist was enough to send entire populations fleeing in terror. This psychological advantage often allowed small raiding parties to achieve objectives that would have required much larger conventional forces. The impact of raiding on the raiders themselves was profound and permanent. Men who had experienced the intensity of battle, the exhilaration of victory, and the wealth that came from successful expeditions found it difficult to return to ordinary life. Many became addicted to the lifestyle, unable to find satisfaction in peaceful pursuits after tasting the intoxicating mixture of danger and reward that raiding provided. This created a class of professional warriors whose primary loyalty was to their crew and their leader, rather than to any particular territory or traditional authority. The technological innovations that emerged from the raiding culture had implications far beyond warfare. The development of superior navigation techniques allowed Vikings to explore and settle areas that no Europeans had ever reached. Their shipbuilding expertise influenced naval architecture throughout the medieval world. Their metalworking skills, honed by the need for reliable weapons and tools, contributed to advances in technology that benefited all of Scandinavian society. The social mobility that raiding provided was revolutionary for its time. A poor farmer's son with courage and skill could return from a successful expedition, wealthy enough to buy land, marry well, and establish himself as a person of importance in his community. This meritocratic aspect of Viking culture, where worth was measured by deeds rather than birth, created a dynamic society that attracted ambitious individuals from across Northern Europe. The crews of raiding expeditions often included men from many different backgrounds, united by their shared desire for wealth and adventure. The intelligence networks that supported Viking raiding were sophisticated and far-reaching. Traders, diplomatic envoys, and even Christian missionaries often served as unwitting sources of information about potential targets. The Vikings maintained detailed knowledge of political situations across Europe, timing their attacks to take advantage of civil wars, succession disputes, and seasonal vulnerabilities. This intelligence gathering was as important to their success as their superior ships and weapons. The cultural exchange that occurred through raiding was extensive despite its violent nature. Vikings returning from expeditions brought back not just treasure and slaves, but new ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. The decorative styles found in Viking art show clear influences from the Celtic, Byzantine, and Islamic cultures they encountered during their raids. Even as they destroyed and pillaged, the raiders were absorbing and adapting elements from the civilizations they attacked. The training of young Vikings for the raiding life began in early childhood and continued throughout their adolescence. Boys learned to swim in the cold northern waters, to handle small boats in rough seas, to fight with weapons, and to endure hardship without complaint. They were taught the stories and traditions that would give meaning to their future exploits, the tactical knowledge that might keep them alive in battle, and the codes of honor that would govern their conduct as warriors. This comprehensive education created men who were uniquely suited to the demands of the raiding lifestyle. As our longship cuts through the dark waters of time, carrying us ever deeper into the world of the Viking raider, we begin to understand that this was more than mere piracy or random violence. This was a complete way of life, a culture built around the pursuit of honor and wealth through courage and skill at arms. The men who lived this life were products of their harsh environment and their unforgiving age, shaped by forces that demanded strength, cunning, and an absolute commitment to their chosen path. The raiders' world was one of extremes, where magnificent courage existed alongside brutal cruelty, where loyalty and betrayal walked hand in hand, where a man might die wealthy and honored or poor and forgotten based on decisions made in the span of a few heartbeats. It was a world that produced some of history's most remarkable individuals, men whose deeds would be remembered in story and song long after their bones had crumbled to dust in foreign soil. The transformation of a Viking raider's identity was complete once he had survived his first successful expedition. No longer was he simply a farmer's son or a fisherman's apprentice. He had become something altogether different, a man who had looked death in the face and emerged victorious. The scars on his body told stories of foreign battles, while the silver arm rings adorning his wrists proclaimed his worth to all who saw him. He walked differently now, with the confident swagger of a proven warrior, his hand never straying far from his sword hilt, even in peaceful surroundings. The bonds forged between crew members during their shared trials were unlike any other relationships in Viking society. These men had saved each other's lives in desperate moments, had shared their last drops of water during endless rowing shifts, had stood back to back against overwhelming odds on foreign shores. The trust between them was absolute and unbreakable. They would address each other as sword brothers, a title more meaningful than any blood relationship. When one prospered, all celebrated. When one fell in battle, all mourned. This brotherhood created networks of loyalty that could span decades and influence the political landscape of entire regions. The wives and families of successful raiders occupied a unique position in their communities. They shared in the glory and wealth their men brought home, but they also bore the constant burden of uncertainty and fear. Every spring departure might be the last time they saw their husbands or sons alive. The long months of waiting were filled with anxiety, as rumours filtered back from traders and travelling merchants about battles fought and ships lost in distant waters. Yet these women also took pride in their men's reputations, knowing that their courage and skill reflected honour upon the entire family. And so our journey through the world of the Viking raider draws to its close. We have sailed the grey northern seas in their dragon ships, felt the spray of foreign shores beneath our boots, and witnessed the fierce brotherhood that bound these warriors together. We have seen how harsh necessity forged a people who would reshape the medieval world through courage, cunning, and an unshakable belief in their own destiny. As you drift towards sleep tonight, may you carry with you the echoes of their saga, and may your dreams be filled with the sound of oars cutting through ancient waters. Thank you for joining me on this voyage into the past. Until we meet again in the realm of history, I wish you a peaceful night.